Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever part of the world you are in. Welcome to Weekender on Sunday. My name is Sunil Kaushal. I'm your host. Today, the Sunday, 21st of November, 2021. What a week it has been, both politically and in sports. Today, the All Blacks lost to France in Paris for the first time over a decade. It's taken a decade for the French to beat us. In India, the Black Caps are playing T20 series before the World Cup Test series start, and so far they are 2-0 down. Also, here in New Zealand, we are seeing the traffic light system coming into place shortly. The Prime Minister this week announced that December 15th will be the day when the country goes into the traffic light system. However, from December 15th to 17th of January, Aucklanders will be allowed to travel outside. Let's wait and see what happens. Even today, there was a groundswell movement where many people across the country protested against the Labour government. In saying so, what we have also seen is in the housing market that Kiwi Bank and BNZ have pulled the plug on over 80. Where does that leave first home buyers when the government was saying we need to help first home buyers? The prices don't seem to come down. In fact, they are going skyrocketing up. Today, I'm joined in the first session by a very good political and economic commentator, Ashley Church, who masters in the housing environment, and his comments are very well respected. In fact, today there has been an article around that, and shortly I'll be joined by Ashley on the page. But we are yet to see what's happening in the housing market across New Zealand. There have been the prices across New Zealand are still going up, and we are seeing a lot of first home buyers being kept out of the market. It is now my privilege to invite Ashley to the screen.
G'day, Sunil.
Good evening, Ashley.
G'day. Hey, you had to mention the rugby. What was with that?
Yes, I did. I mean, it was a little bit disappointing, wasn't it? I think the All Blacks played a really good game, but hey, let's not take anything away from them, because the French played really well. Don't you think so?
Yeah, they did. In fact, the French this week and the Irish last week both played like an All Black team, which I mean that as a compliment. They actually played really well. They played like we would normally play. But
yeah, I think there are already memes flying around about Scott Robertson, waiting in the wings. But I still think they should give them a chance.
Anyway, let's not panic. Let's not panic. Hopefully,
that's time for the Rugby World Cup to come. Anyway, going on to the matter at hand is you just wrote an article in One Roof on the property prices and what's happening there. And you mentioned that the previous two Reserve Bank governors had warned that the prices would plummet. And but we are not seeing that yet, or will we ever see? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so where that article came from was, so I write one of these things every week, and I sat down beginning of last week to write that one. And one of the issues that really irks me, Sunil, is or one of the phenomena that really irks me is young people when I talk to them about buying a house and whether they ask when they should buy. And my general view is you should buy right now. Who then proceed to delay their purchase, and they do that often on the basis of advice or commentary that they've read from market commentators. Now, sometimes that's the trading banks. Sometimes it's people like me and Cameron Bagri and Tony Alexander. But often it's on the back of statements by the finance minister or the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank in particular has made some pretty strong statements about the property market over the last 25 years. And the problem with that is that, and this surprises people when I say it, but often they're wrong. In fact, more often than not, they're wrong. Now, why that concerns me is because people are actually making a conscious decision to delay purchasing a property because the Reserve Bank right now, for example, is telling them that house prices will taper off or even drop when the opposite's happening. So it means that people who delay are actually putting themselves in a position where it's actually they're making it so harder for themselves. And so my position's always been, regardless of what happens to the market going forward, the time to buy is always right now, particularly if you're a first-time buyer. If the market keeps going up, which of course is my expectation, then that's obviously good. It proves to be a good decision. If the market drops, then worst case scenario is they've lost a little bit of equity in the short term, but ultimately the market has an upward trend. So yeah, sorry, Chanel, carry on.
I was going to ask, 87 obviously saw the market crash in New Zealand pretty badly.
Yep.
Then when the GFC hit us, we didn't see too much of a negative.
Interesting you should say that. So when you say the market crashed in 87, it's interesting. The stock market crashed in 87. The property market didn't. The property market, in fact, you have to go right back to the 70s to see the last time. So firstly, it's probably important that we define what a crash is, because there's no formal definition. So my definition has always been a property market crash is a reduction in values of more than 20%, which is sustained, and by which I mean it stays with us for a long time. The last time that happened was between 1975 and 1980. So from 1970 to 1975, the Kiwi property market doubled. In fact, it was our first property boom in modern history. And between 1975 and 1980, it dropped by 38%. And so by the time we got to the end of the beginning of 1980, the end of 1979, the market was in more or less the same place as it had been 10 years ago. That has never happened again. So people talk about 87, but the 87 crash was a stock market crash. It wasn't a property crash. And again, they'll talk about the Asian financial crisis in the 90s. They'll talk about the dot-com crash. They'll talk about the GFC in 2007, 2008. In all of those, although those were big hits on the global economy, they were moderate, only moderate hits on the property economy. And interestingly, the only one of those three that I just mentioned that had any real tangible effect on the property market was the GFC. And even then, the effect of that was for the property market to drop back from about 9% off its previous high and to stay there for about 12 or 18 months and then start going up again. So this continual talk of a crash, this continual, excuse me if I cough, by the way, I'm suffering from a bit of flu at the moment. It's not COVID. This continual talk from commentators about waiting for a crash and waiting for the market to correct, and that's the term they use. It's not to say that it couldn't happen, but it hasn't happened in 40 odd years.
So actually, what's the you talk about that, but what's the impact of immigration on property prices? Because when you look at this, when you look at the outset of it, right, we say, okay, immigration has slowed down. However, 165,000 people have got the option to apply for a permanent residency. Now, not all of them may get it, but even if we take, let's say 30%, or let's say a rough number, 50,000, surely they would want to buy a new home.
Yeah, so I have a view that's different to just about everybody else in the market. So let me see if I can explain. So if you go back 25 odd years, when I first started really commentating on this stuff, I shared a view which was pretty similar to the view of most of the other commentators in the market, which was to say that there were a variety of things that made house prices go up, which included which included immigration, which you've just talked about, which included whether supply was up or down, which included things like foreign buyers coming into the market. So in my view, there were a whole range of factors that influenced house prices. Over the last 20 years, I have kind of ticked each of those off and come to the conclusion actually that they don't influence house prices to any great degree. In fact, I've so far have I moved from my original position that my view now is that the property market, 90% of the movement in house prices over the last 40 years has been interest rates. But specifically the dropping of interest rates, the lowering of interest rates from their very high levels in the mid-1980s down to the low levels that they're at now. So while I accept that immigration is a factor and it can influence house prices, I don't believe that it has the impact that most other commentators do. And I say that because, and let me give you a really simple example. If you go back to, if we take the last 4 decades, if you go back to the 80s, we had very high interest rates, we had very high inflation, we had low immigration. In fact, we had declining immigration. We had more people leaving the country than coming in. And over that decade, house prices doubled. You go forward to the 90s, we had inflation coming down, interest rates coming down. We still had low immigration. And in that decade, house prices doubled. If you flick forward to the last 10 years, we've had very low interest rates, very low inflation, high immigration, and house prices doubled. Now, that's a very simplistic tool. Obviously, it's not exact, but what it does is it gives you an indication of the fact that the housing market has done more or less the same thing in each of those decades for 40 years, but the underlying factors have been quite, including immigration, have been quite different. So I simply don't believe that it's the big driver of house prices that other people do.
Sure. Now, some of the banks, a couple of banks have pulled away from the first home buyer market, which is obviously 80% and over.
Yeah.
Do you think we will see more of these institutions doing the same? And what will happen to the first home buyers then?
Yeah, so there's two sets of tools. The first one was the loan-to-value ratio restrictions, which came in 2013, and they're actually implemented by the Reserve Bank. So when the Reserve Bank implements, the trading banks have no choice; they have to do what they're told. And certainly what they call the first-tier banks have to do that. And when they introduced those, they introduced them on the basis that they were going to. It's really interesting. Alan Bollard was the Reserve Bank governor at the time, and his argument for bringing them in, he said, was to reduce house prices. And they didn't do that. 5 or 6 years later, house prices had increased by another 50-odd%. So then he came out and he changed the narrative, and he said they're not about reducing house prices. They're actually about stabilizing the market. Now, that was a straw man because there was no basis for any argument to say that the market needed to be stabilized. But what they did was they acted as a disincentive to first-home buyers in particular get into a home. So if you're somebody who's got an existing property, then you've got equity. And so the process of selling one property to buy another is easier for you. But if you're a first-home buyer and you're confronted with the need for a 20% deposit, and you're in Auckland, where your median house price is over $1 million, that's a deposit. In some cases, there are some exceptions to this, but that's a deposit of 200,000 or more to purchase a home. So I've been of the view for a long time that the Reserve Bank should get rid of those LVR restrictions. It's certainly for first-home buyers because they're basically just an obstacle to getting a home. But what have they done? Instead of getting rid of them, they've now gone even further, and they're introducing another tool, which hasn't come in yet, but I think BNZ and ASB have already implemented it voluntarily, called a debt-to-income ratio. The debt-to-income ratio is a different tool, whereas the loan-to-value ratio restrictions are about the deposit. Debt-to-income ratio restrictions are about how much you earn. And so what it says is, it doesn't matter how big your deposit is. If you've got a household income of, let's say, 200 grand, you're earning 120 and your partner's earning 80, then you will be able to borrow up to a maximum of, and they haven't set that number yet, but let's say it's 7, then at 200 grand, you'd be able to borrow a maximum of 1.4 million. Now, that would probably get you into a home in Auckland with a deposit. But if your income was much less than that, and for a lot of households it is, let's say it was 150 or 120, it becomes much, much more difficult to buy any sort of dwelling in Auckland that you're actually going to be able to live in. So my concern is the combination of the loan-to-value ratio restrictions and the debt-to-income restrictions, which are coming in the next few months. We're basically closing out an entire generation of first-home buyers, certainly in Auckland.
Because what you've just said is that, the house prices may not come down.
Yep.
Historically, they've gone up.
Yep.
But the first-home buyers' debt-to-income ratio will probably pull them out. So
Absolutely.
So when the government says housing affordability, what do you understand by that?
The government and the Reserve Bank, to a lesser degree, are obsessed with this idea that they can influence the market. They believe that if they do these things, that they will cause house prices to drop. Now, that's nonsense. I'm very clearly of the view, Sunil, it can't be done. It can't be done. And 40 years of evidence shows us that. We've had governments of both colours over the last 40 years that have done all manner of things to try and influence the housing market, and they can influence it for about 5 seconds. So, and you've seen that recently. The Reserve Bank will do something, and for a week or two, there'll be a bit of nervousness, and then the market recovers and it just carries on doing what it's going to do. So this idea that the Reserve Bank and the government can influence house prices is just nonsense. So when they talk about affordability, that's what they mean. They say, we're going to influence the market, and we're going to cause house prices to drop, and by doing that, we're going to get first-home buyers back into the market. They've demonstrated they're completely unable to do that, and in my view, they won't ever be able to do that. The market is its own beast, and it operates in its own way and in its own time.
So, with the first home buyers, what we are saying is, government is pushing for the intensification, and multi-storage, no car parks, living around the train station or transportation, etc. However, no matter how small the house is, how small the apartment is, the prices are not coming down.
No, and they won't. That's my view is that they won't. And it's interesting you should raise those other things, because those things around building around train stations and transport hubs and what have you. There's an ideological element to that. So they're confusing the economics of house buying with the ideology around whatever it is, whether it's around climate change or whether it's around this idea of integrated cities that are where you've got intensification, whatever those things are. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to load on, which is a relatively simple thing, the buying of a house, a whole range of other expectations of society, and in the process of doing that, ending up with something that actually doesn't mean anything to anybody. And it's interesting because if you go back to the big building booms in our country in the past and look at the history of how those have happened, they've happened for two reasons. One, they've happened because there was a specific issue at the time which caused so the big one I can think of is back in the 70s and the 60s was the baby boomers. And so there was a huge increase in the population of the country and the number of babies being born, and so there was a need for new houses. But the other thing that drove that is that there was very specific surgical support from the government to enable people to do that, and that support's gone. So what they've done is they've moved away from helping the individual to trying to do these great big policy settings that are going to somehow change the market. And in my view, if you want to help first-time buyers, go back to the approach that you had 50 years ago, which is to help people specifically. And there was one thing in particular, I don't know if you want me to go into it, but there was a thing called the family benefit. I'm not sure whether you're aware of that, Sunil. Yeah. But family benefit was a universally paid benefit by the government to every family, regardless of whether they were rich or poor, per child. And when I was a kid, that was $6 per kid per week. So what it meant was if you had a family of 5 or 6 kids, and remember the purpose of that benefit was to try and encourage people to have lots of children, that added up in a year. It could be quite a significant amount of money. Now, what they did in 1964, which happens to be the year I was born, was they passed an act called the Family Benefit Housing Act, and the intention behind that was to say to people, if you wanted to buy a house, instead of getting $6 per week per child, they would capitalize it, and they would give you a lump sum amount that you could use it as a deposit for a house. Now, over the next 20 years, tens of thousands of Kiwis capitalized their family benefit and went and bought a home. And so you saw the effect of that. And so all these building companies started up. You saw massive developments. Suburbs like Pakuranga and Auckland were developed essentially on the back of that. And there was an equivalent of that in most parts of the country. And that carried on right through until, I think, about 1986 when it was scrapped. And the reason it was scrapped, and I don't blame them for doing this, Labor had come in and they were implementing their Rogenomics reforms, and they decided it wasn't reasonable to have a universal benefit that got paid to people that didn't need it. And so they replaced it with what they used to call working for family support, what's now called working for families, and which was a good idea because it meant that they could pay more to a smaller group of people. But the problem with that was because you didn't necessarily get it every year, because your circumstances might change, you could no longer capitalize it. So the ability to do that was taken away. And interestingly, if you look at what happened with first home ownership, it actually started to drop off in the early 90s, not long after that scheme had disappeared. So clearly it had an impact, an increase in home ownership. And from the 90s onward, that started to taper off because we no longer have that state support in place.
So at the moment, as of today, if you're living in Auckland or any of those bigger suburbs or regions like Wellington or Christchurch or Dunedin, if you don't have 20%,
yep,
as a young person, it's very hard to get yourself in a home.
There are some exceptions, as you'll know. I think Westpac have got a 5% scheme from memory, and there's a couple of other banks that have got different schemes, and I think there is some changes. The other good thing to remember too is if you're building new, then the deposit's not 20%, it's 10%. And so that makes it easier as well. So there are, when I talk about that 20%, obviously it's a blunt instrument.
Yeah, but I'll just, you said building new, right?
Yes.
But and I know what's happening these days.
Yep.
So, as of current situation, you may still get approval for new build, but there's nothing coming. And I think in the paper today said, 35% it's gone up.
Yep.
Someone who signed a thing in March,
yep,
now the price has gone at least 15% up.
Yeah, it's crazy. And that's partly a reflection of what's going on in the market. There's suddenly been this emphasis on new. So what happens? Price goes up. It's the classic supply and demand. And so we're going to see more of that. I still think that that's still a good opportunity for people who can get into it, but that gap's going to close. It's going to get more and more difficult because as you say, the price is going to go up and it's going to
Do
become
you
a
think
big.
we will have oversupply of houses?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So probably the best template I can give for that. By the way, so the oversupply is an interesting term because it's only ever true at a point in time. Because the country will always mop up its need for houses. So oversupply is simply a description of what might be happening at a particular point in time. The best example we've got of that is Christchurch. So for after the earthquake and the obviously the demolishing of a lot of homes in the red zone, Christchurch went into overdrive, basically building homes really quickly to make up for the deficit of housing. And so there was an undersupply for a period of time until they did that. And you saw what happened. Christchurch house prices flattened out. So for a period while the rest of the country was going up quite dramatically, Christchurch prices were staying more or less static because there was an undersupply. They needed all the houses that they could build. So it wasn't possible to oversupply the market. Now, when Christchurch has caught up with the rest of the country, Christchurch prices are starting to do what the rest of the country is doing, or have been for some time, which is going up quite dramatically. So could there be oversupply? Yes. Again, I said to you before that I had a different view to everybody else on immigration. I also have a different view on this whole issue around supply and demand, in that I'm not entirely sure that even now, today, 2021, we actually have a shortage of homes. And the reason I say that is when I look at the numbers, and I won't bore you with the detail, but if I look at the numbers of houses built in this country since about 1986, and the reason I picked that year is because that's the first year that the census started measuring something called average household occupancy. I can see that the average household occupancy is a measure that tells you the average number of people that lives in a New Zealand home. So we know if we go back to 1986, the average number of Kiwis that lived in a New Zealand home was 3.29 people per home. So if you divided all the houses in the country by the population, you got 3.29. We know that by 2013, that figure had dropped to 2.89. Why is that important? Because the only way that number could drop is if you had built more houses than you needed. So what that tells me is that between 1986 and 2013, the country had not only kept up with the number of homes it required, it actually oversupplied the market. So that flies in the face of this argument that we need another 100,000 homes quickly. So I don't necessarily buy into that even now.
So what about the regions? What we are seeing is obviously the regions are booming.
Yep.
What's the reason for that?
Two reasons. One of them is so I come from Hawke's Bay. I've moved back here obviously after 20 odd years. And when I left here in 1998, I actually moved to Palmerston for 3 years, and then I went to Auckland. But why I eventually went to Auckland was because to do the sorts of things that I wanted to do with my career, I had to be in Auckland or Wellington. There was only two choices. 20 years on, and two things have changed quite dramatically to change that. The first of those is that transport links have improved dramatically. Roads are better, air links to regional centres. For me, the airport's just down the road there. And there's 5 or 6 flights a day to Auckland, whereas once upon a time there was 1 or 2. But the other thing, the single biggest change is ultra-fast broadband. So the difference for me now, so I operate my business from here, and in fact, I'm not even in Napier, Sunil. I'm about 20 minutes north in a beach community. And the reason I can do that, so my business, I operate virtually all of it from here remotely, and I can do that because the internet connection that I have is as good as the connection that I would have if I was in Auckland or Wellington or Tokyo or London or New York. And so what's happening is a lot of people who previously had no ability to do that, so they had to be in Auckland or Wellington, can now run their businesses from all sorts of different parts of the country. It's a major change, and that's encouraging people to move here, to move to other parts of regional New Zealand and to buy houses, and that's pushing house prices up.
So, but are you saying that there's a big influx of Aucklanders to the regions?
Not just Aucklanders, Aucklanders, Wellingtonians, Cantabrians, even other from other regional parts of the country. People can move around a lot more freely.
If that's the argument, then why is it that the house prices, when they leave, it's still going up?
Oh, because the demand in Auckland is a beast all of its own, and Auckland's still growing. So even though people are leaving Auckland to go to other parts of New Zealand, Auckland itself is still growing through things like the immigration that you talked about before. And through because it's a sort of a two-way thing. As one lot of people go one way, one lot of people go the other. So Auckland's always going to be 40 to 45% of the population of the country. no matter how many people it loses to the regions. So I see that more as an overflow of Auckland than necessarily people abandoning Auckland. Auckland's always going to be the vibrant heart of New Zealand. That's never going to change.
So which regions do you think, let's say, sooner or later, one of these months or in the coming future, let's say 6 months, hopefully not that long, but international borders will be open.
Yeah.
We will see, and that's what the commentators like yourselves and others are saying, we'll see an influx of Kiwis returning home.
Yeah.
And when they do, we don't have enough. Do you think at that time the property prices will start going up?
I think the property prices are going up now, and I think that they will continue going up. I don't think it'll make any change to the phenomenon that we're seeing at the moment. So, for example, I don't expect. I know there's a bit of talk at the moment about a correction in the market. I see nothing to suggest to me that will happen. So, all of the things that you're talking about will simply continue to feed those increases that, for me, are already taking place. Probably the bigger question is, where will those people go? So if they're Kiwis, then they'll go back to where they came from in a lot of cases. So if they came from the regions, they'll go back to the regions. Probably the more important is what will happen to people who are immigrating to New Zealand from other parts of the world, and that will depend a lot, I think, on the level of sophistication of those people as migrants. If they're people that, how can I put this? If they're people that come from parts of the world where they've got a reasonable understanding of New Zealand already. So, for example, folk from India and other parts of Southeast Asia who already know New Zealand, or at least know where it is and that it exists, then they're likely to have probably a more sophisticated understanding and view of the regional economies as well as Auckland and Wellington. If they're from parts of the world where they don't know those things, then they would tend to be drawn to Auckland because that's the magnet. And so they've got no reason to know of any of these other places. So again, you'll get that, some of it will spread to Auckland, so Auckland will keep growing, and some of it will go to other parts of New Zealand because you've got these more sophisticated immigrants who recognise that they can do what they want to do from anywhere throughout the country.
What we have seen is obviously the rise of not little, but cities like Hamilton and the adjoining Cambridge, etc.
Yep.
But in the next 10 years, do you see other cities, coming up and comparing with Auckland? I mean, like North
population-wise.
Yeah, population.
Yes.
And,
it's already happening. Yeah, I do, Sunil. It's already happening. By the way, cities are a slightly misleading term because New Zealand has districts and cities, and it's a weird designation. So what we call a district sometimes is actually a city in all but name. But so, for example, Hastings is a district and Napier's a city, but they're actually both cities. It's just that Hastings has a whole lot of land around it. So yes, I do. So and pretty much you'd be hard pressed to find any region in New Zealand where the major centres weren't growing. And you look around, you drive around New Zealand, and you drive around sort of the peripherals of these cities, and you'll find that there are developments taking place, that there's new building going on. And I don't see, I was in Tianau earlier this year, and of all places, and it was growing. Yeah, I mean there was a subdivision there going, and so everywhere you go in this great country of ours, there's development taking place, and that there are more houses being built, and that just seems to be an ongoing thing, and I think that's positive. I'd be interested to see if that was the same phenomenon that was going on in other parts of the world. I suspect that it would be. I think it's a demographic change that's taken place worldwide, in that people have recognised that they no longer have to be in the main cities if they don't want to be. They can be anywhere in countries like ours.
Sure. So in the next, let's say 5 to 10 years, which cities, districts, etc., do you think will increase? And do you think they will also follow suit of Auckland about housing intensification?
Yeah, I do. So the second question, I do. I just think that's a natural.
Why is that?
Because a lot of that stuff's being driven by climate change. So it's an ideological thing being driven by councils' planning and district plans. So it's around wanting to intensify to make better use of land rather than spreading out over arable land. And so I think you'll tend to see this philosophy of putting people together in much tighter hubs, which I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. It's just a change from what we've got now. In terms of the cities themselves, Tauranga and Hamilton have already for quite some period of time been growing. Bay of Plenty as a whole has been growing quite substantially. The Waikato, I think you'll see that footprint continue to move further south. So Hawke's Bay, where I am here, Manawatu, and the Taranaki, I think, are all areas where you'll expect to see change taking place and growth in the central cities in each of those locations. And in the South Island, places like Timaru, Nelson, Dunedin, even in Invercargill, I think, I would be very surprised if that growth wasn't evenly spread right throughout the country. The only area where you won't see that intensification, I think, to the same degree, unless the ideology takes precedence, is in places like Invercargill and Timaru, where land's simply not an issue. But there is also another lobby around the effective use of productive land. So the rural lobby that basically says, hey, this land should be kept aside because it's used for farming or for the production of food, and it shouldn't be available for residential. And that's been an ongoing debate in this country for 100 years, and that will continue to be there. And that will also drive some of the things that are happening around intensification.
Just lastly, do you think the intensification is a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a different thing. I don't like it personally. I've grown up in a society where we've had fairly wide open spaces and we've had homes on a fairly large piece of land, and an infrastructure which has been designed to accommodate that. But I'm old. I'm 57. I'll be 58 next year, and the new view from younger people is that they want community living, and they want to live in communities where the services that transport and retail and commercial and all those services are on their doorstep, where they don't necessarily need to have a car. So it's a style and design thing. And so I think if we were able to fast forward 50 years and have a look at what we look like, our cities will look very different to what they do now. You and I, not wanting to speak for you, Sunil, but you and I might not necessarily like that, but the younger people who are coming through will probably think it's wonderful.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for your insights and your comments. That was Ashley Church, property commentator, who spoke to us about intensification, housing, where the interest rates are going, how the housing market is doing.